In this video, we're going to begin discussing the basics of algebra. Now, in order to discuss the basics, we have to have some terms so that we can communicate about, well, the math. And so the first term we're going to look at is this thing called a quantity. Now, as I'm going, if you think I'm going too fast, feel free to pause the video so that way you can get these definitions in your notes. But a quantity is anything that can be measured or counted. This can represent any number of things. This could be the number of people in a classroom. This could be the number of chips in a bag, the number of strokes at golf. So a quantity can really be anything. It's just something that can be measured and counted. And this is where math comes from. It comes from counting. And then we kind of make it more complex and add these things called variables. Now in Algebra 1, we talk a lot about variables. Now a variable is a symbol that represents one or more quantities. Now a variable can change, meaning a variable could represent 4, it could represent 2. It all depends on the situation. And a lot of times in Algebra 1, we're trying to solve for a variable in a particular problem. Now, typically, a variable is a letter that could be an English letter or it could be a Greek letter. So we could be using X, we could use Y, or you could even use a smiley face if you really wanted to, but it gets kind of messy. So let's stick with letters. So with a variable, we now have these things called algebraic expressions. Now, you've spent a lot of time working with expressions in general. Now, expressions are just statements in math. They're like phrases in English. And a really important thing about an expression is that there's no equal sign. So, in our definition of algebraic expression, we say that it is a statement with one or more variables. And knowing what an expression is means there's no equal sign. So for example, I could have something like x minus 5. That is an algebraic expression. It has a variable and no equal sign. Now, on the same token, we also have this thing called a numeric expression. And it's kind of what you think. It's a statement with no variables. The word numeric comes from the root word number. So, numeric expression, you've been working with these ever since kindergarten. 2 plus 2. When we talk about basic addition, 2 plus 2, that is a numeric expression. So long as there is no equal sign, it is an expression. Once there's an equal sign, we call it an equation. We'll get to that in a little bit. Now here I have an algebraic expression, and I want to dissect it a little bit and look at some of its components. Now, it may not look very complicated because it's not, but there's still some important information we need to know. The next term we talk about is this thing called a constant. If you think about the word constant, it means it never changes. So our definition, at least in math, when we're talking about constants, is it's a number. Or constants would be numbers, plural. So in this expression, here I've got 13 is a constant. It never changes. 13 isn't just going to miraculously represent 14. It's not going to change. So 3 will always represent 1, 2, 3 things. That never changes. Now with these constants and variables, we like to do things. Now thinking about English, operations are the equivalents of verbs. They are the actions that we are taking in our algebraic expression or equation. Now there are 4 big ones: adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. The stuff you've been working with since grade school. Now there are more operations. We could square things, we could take the square root, we could do all kinds of different stuff, absolute value. Those are all different operations. But they're all mostly derived from adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. So think of operations as the verb of math. Now let's take this a little bit further. So we've talked about quantities, we've talked about variables and expressions. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do a little translating. One of the biggest issues in math, at least in high school math class, is when it comes to word problems and trying to figure out what does the problem want me to do. And a lot of that comes down to being able to translate what's being said into math. So we're going to translate these phrases into algebraic expression. Now just remember, algebraic expression, there is no equal sign. So let's try a couple, then you're going to do two. So the first one here, I have 8 times a number n. Now whenever we're translating, we always want to work left to right. So here I've got 8 times. Now times, if you remember, is multiplication. Now here's the thing, we're graduating a little bit, we're moving up. We no longer use the x for multiplication. That's no longer allowed. So let's say I do 8 times x. If I do 8 times x and I'm using this x, which one is my variable and which one's multiplication? So we're no longer using this x to represent multiplication. We use the dot, we use parentheses, or in the case of 8x, we just put 8x together. So back to our original problem, we had 8 times a number n. Okay, so 8 times, this phrase, a number n, sounds weird. Here's what it means. A number n simply means that n is the variable we're going to use in this problem. N can represent any number of things. So that's why we just use n. So it'll look like that, 8 times n. Or we could do 8 parentheses n, or we could just do 8n. Now whenever we're multiplying, like so, we always want to put the number out front. And this has a new definition. This is called the coefficients. This is something you need to write down. The coefficient is the number out front, and it is a very important term to know. Let's do one more. So the quotient of 5 and a number n. Okay, let's work left to right. So quotient, if you remember, is division. So we're dividing something. Now, since we're working left to right, we're going to follow the order that it's written. So the quotient of 5, so 5 divided by a number n. Remember, that means our variable. So 5 divided by n, or we could even put 5 over n. Now the video is going to pause, or go ahead and pause on your own. I want you to work out these two examples. Now that you've tried a few on your own, let's move on to a couple of equations. So if you remember the definition we looked at earlier, an equation means that the phrase is going to have an equal sign. So when we see equation, that means there needs to be an equal sign. Now we also have this thing called an inequality, but we'll get to inequalities a little later. So let's take a look at the first example, and then you're going to do the second one. So the first one says the difference of 13 and a number n is 9. So we're going to work left to right and write this as an equation. So first of all, I know that difference is subtraction. So when I work with difference, I do the same thing as quotient. I work left to right. So the difference of 13, there's that phrase, a number n, meaning my variable. So 13 minus n. Now there's one important word here that kind of indicates that this is an equation. And it's that word is. Is means, a little quotes around that, is means equal. Okay? Is indicates an equal sign. When that's all you see, you know that's going to be an equal sign. Now we could say something like is greater than, is less than. That would bring about inequalities, but we'll talk about that later. So let's finish this up. Is 9. Okay, you take a few seconds, pause the video, and try the question below. We have 2 more terms to talk about, and then we're done with our initial definitions. So the next definition we're going to talk about is a thing called an exponent. Now an exponent, I have an example here, is the number written up here real small above the number. A synonym for it would be a power. Now what this does is an exponent is a form of multiplication. Now when I look at this, when I see I have 4, this is called to the 5th power, 4 to the exponent of 5. This doesn't mean I do 4 times 5. Now 4 has a special name too. 4 is called the base. Now here's what we do. Since I have 4 raised to the 5th power, what we're going to do is we're going to do 4 times itself 5 times. So I see here that my power is 5, so I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 4s. And then I multiply all of those together. That's how exponents work. We take the base and times itself that many times. So in the case of 4 to the 5th, I would have 1024. Now those are the beginning definitions for our Algebra 1.